grüße Sie ganz herzlich. Wir haben, das ist eine Premiere, einen Vortrag vor der Ausstellungseröffnung. Jennifer Kabat, Autorin, Schriftstellerin, die sowohl im Staat New York als auch in London lebt, wird uns aus sehr subjektiver Perspektive einführen in das Werk von Isa Genzken. Wir haben bei dieser Ausstellung auch, was den Katalog betrifft, sehr explizit Autoren eingeladen mit einem nicht-europäischen Hintergrund, um einfach nochmal eine andere Perspektive kennenzulernen auf das Werk von Isa Genzken, was zumindest in der bestehenden Literatur immer sehr stark aus einer europäischen Perspektive rezipiert worden ist, insbesondere in Bezug auf den europäischen Modernismus. Jennifer Kabat geht anders heran, was man schon an ihrem Titel, finde ich, merkt: The Bauhaus Disco, 18 Thoughts on the Grace Building, Ghost Estates and Isa Genzken. Jennifer Kabat schreibt für die Financial Times, für den Guardian, für New York Magazine, für Freeze und zahlreiche andere, durchaus auch lokale Zeitungen. Sie liebt ganz unterschiedliche Herangehensweise an Kunst und Design, aus einer subjektiven, persönlichen Ebene, teilweise aber auch aus einer abstrakten, kunsthistorischen Perspektive. Insofern freue ich mich sehr. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for this. I don't know if we call it a lecture or presentation. I think
it might be a cross between a lecture and a presentation, and it might have some meditations in it.
Very good.
Hi. So you know the title of my talk. It's 18 Thoughts on the Grace Building, Ghost Estates. Sorry, I'm just going to move this a little bit like that so I'm not bending. So my talk is the Bauhaus Disco, 18 Thoughts on the Grace Building, Ghost Estates, and Isa Genzken. And I'm going to tell you a story tonight about Isa Genzken in kind of 18 parts, and it's going to pull together diverse ideas. Some of them are personal, and some are on her work, and this is all going to be an attempt to conjure and explain the genius of this woman whose art I love. And through these 18 points, I'm going to interpret her work for you. And so, my first point is a skyscraper too far. Now, this part of the story is a fable. It's about an empty skyscraper, which, if you bear with me, seems an apt introduction to her work, or perhaps to my take on her work. And the fable is set in Paris, not in Berlin or New York, as you might expect if you know her work. And the title, A Skyscraper Too Far, was actually a headline in The Economist magazine about a month ago. And I read it, and I immediately thought of Isa Genzken. The article was largely about the state of commercial real estate in Europe, in the recovery, or whatever the current economic moment we're in is now. But it started off with this ghost business park in Paris called La Défense. It's Europe's biggest purpose-built office complex, The Economist called it. It's the Manjuga Tower, and there it is. It glitters its silver angles, raking up with jaunty zigs and zags towards the sky, and it is big and empty. And it will probably stay empty for years. This, the empty building, driven by speculation, the idea of a ghost skyscraper, all of it seemed ready for Genzken to ponder, to transform and question. So I stared at the picture in the magazine and wondered, what would Isa do? And in the US, if you know the US at all, it's a phrase that the religious right has kind of coined, as in, what would Jesus do? And where it comes to thinking of architecture, the built world, and the social sphere, in my mind, Isa Genzken is a deity. So this has been the subject of her work for 3 decades: architecture, building, the city. And in my opinion, this makes her one of the most important artists of her generation. So this tower, and what she'd see and comment on in it, seemed to me a perfect metaphor and way into her work. Because her subject matter is all around us, and it's more relevant than ever now. I mean, this was just a passing headline in The Economist, but for decades she's been thinking about these subjects, about cities and urbanism and economies and the built world, and her work undoes the world around us and lays it bare for us, and she can show us the skyscraper too far. So, number 2. I'm going to give you a brief chronology, as if just to get the art history out of the way, so that we can kind of skip on. But this is also a way for me to kind of show you that, yes, she has been dealing with these things for about 30 years. And so my chronology, in fact, my brisk tour, I'm going to try and make this very brisk because I am not a fan of history myself, is going to start in 1983 with this drawing of hers here. And it's named Mies, of course, for Mies van der Rohe, and it looks very tower-like. And it also kind of grows out of her very early work, which if you go upstairs, you'll see her ellipsoids and hyperbolos, which are kind of perfectly carved by hand from wood, but using a computer program. And you'll also see the relationship to this other work from 1983, Diana, which also suggests a tower. And then we have her plaster buildings. And this one is actually Mühlberg, which you will know, speaking German, as I do not particularly well, means pile of rubbish. And she did, at this point in her career, this is in sort of the early mid-'80s, a bunch of kind of plaster buildings that had very Platonic names, like Haus, Bahnhof, and Chapel. And then she moves on to these concrete maquettes. And they all are both sort of buildings and the fragments of buildings and sort of suggest architecture. And there's the last installation shot. And onto Spiegel here, mirror, which of course frames this building and makes us re-see it. And also it's a building she hated, so it's kind of this great figure towering over it, so we have to see it again. And then there are her more light research paintings, which take the facades of skyscrapers from the early 90s. And then in Chicago, and in fact, I'm just going to skip back a second. That's actually taken from an X-brace in Chicago on the Hancock Tower. And then in Chicago, she makes a film called Chicago Drive, which is, in fact, a movie about architecture in Chicago. And these are two stills from it. And then she starts just isolating windows, as if she has taken the walls of glass from a skyscraper and turned them into their own thing. And the X-braces, too. And then she goes to New York City, and she makes a book called I Heart New York, Crazy City, about the architecture there. And she starts taking photos of the buildings in New York in her New York, New York series. And then, notice that, moves on to this, to become her Deutsche Bank proposal for the AT&T building. And then we get Fuck the Bauhaus, which are about buildings in New York City. And then we get her beach huts, which are also upstairs. And her columns, named for friends and people whose work she respects. And her installation with Wolfgang Tillmans. And her architecture collages. And her new buildings for Berlin. And her social facades. And then her exterior for the building at the Venice Biennale for her installation there, Oil in the German Pavilion, in 2007. And lastly, taking us almost up to the present, to a few years ago, is her work, her proposal for Ground Zero at the World Trade Center site. And that's her memorial tower. So that is, in a nutshell, 30 years of architecture. You can go home now. You can go see the work. No, I'm going to keep going. I'm actually going to move back before 1983. That's next. So, the clean and simple truth. So I'm going to take you back to the late 70s when these issues in her work sort of begin. And I'm not going to be talking in this section about architecture, but advertising and product design. So, in an interview with Nicholas Schaffhausen, who just walked in the room a few years ago, she said she wants to ask you to look at the bigger world and how her work makes you consider it. And she, in fact, said to him, with my work, you have to and you ought to associate. So this is what she's asking us to do, to associate, to think, to consider. And in these ads here, she re-photographed of hi-fis. She did these in 1979. And she showed these with her hyperbolos and ellipsoids at MoMA. So here they are in context, because she wanted you to put these two things together. And these images were the clean and perfect and simple truth. I think that's what the clean and simple truth, as the American ad says. And this is the context for her work, is showing them with the hyperbolas and the ellipsoids. So in another interview in 2003, she talks about what she was thinking in the 70s with these. And she says, everyone has one of these towers at home. It's the latest thing, the most modern equipment available. So a sculpture must be at least as modern and must stand up to it. Must be at least as good as this advert. With any sculpture, you have to be able to say, although this is not a ready-made, it could be one. It must have a certain relation to reality. A sculpture is really a photo. Although it can be shifted, it must always have an aspect that reality has too. So basically, what she's saying is sculpture should reach out to our world. And what is more real than our built world? And in her work, she asks us to make associations. She demands this of us. So her work isn't removed from our world. And this asks us to make connections. And her work quotes and questions, challenges, and sometimes it'll even crack jokes. But throughout, she's asking questions of the world around us and demanding we look too. So now, the negative hallucinations. Now, this is a phrase that I thought seemed perfect for understanding her work and what its power is. And it's a phrase that isn't hers, but comes from an artist in New York named Daniel Balskov, who talks about it as the world we miss and overlook in our daily life. Now, the things we don't notice, the things that we just sort of walk on by so that we can function in the world. But what part of art's power is that it opens us up to this. It asks us to see things anew, to have an awareness. And this is the touch of reality she brings, is this reframing. And so the actual quote he has is, a real hallucination is seeing something that isn't there. But a negative hallucination is actually a condition where you don't see something that is there. That happens all the time, culturally or just visually. I'm not talking about blind spots, but conditioning your mind because there's something else in the way. It overrides what you see. Only Isa Genzken overrides the overriding. Through her work, she opens up the city to us, to seeing it, and the streets, and the buildings, and the things we would otherwise just ignore. So, while we're talking about ignoring, I have a question, which you're not going to answer yet. How many famous women architects can you name? So, before we go on to answering this, I should explain that I'm talking about her and architecture for another reason, and that's to make a point. And in fairness to you and her and myself, I'm going to tell you what that point is. Because there are plenty of ways to examine Genzken's work. And recently, there's a big career retrospective of hers at MoMA, which was great. I mean, like, it exposed a lot of North America to Genzken. Only everyone, at least all the critics, pretty much focused on her biography and their reviews of the show. Now, as women, we're kind of always subject to our biographies, our boyfriends, lovers, husbands, kids, what have you. And it's boring, and it's disempowering. Instead, other equally valid ways to consider her work would be through her friendships and collaborations, or photography in the cinema, or her humor, which is great and destabilizing. Just look at the title for the show here, The Only Female Fool. There's also assemblage in how she takes stuff from the everyday world and recontextualizes it. But architecture, now that is my focus. And not simply because it's a theme from very early on, but also to make a statement, a feminist statement. So, how many famous women architects can you name? Anybody? Take a stab? Come on. Zaha Hadid. Okay, that's good. That's one. Okay. So, I can name about 3 off the top of my head, and I write about architecture. So that's a sad sign. And mine are Zaha Hadid, Denise Scott Brown, and Annabelle Seldorf. Now, of these, one's architecture practice was subsumed under her husband's, and that's Denise Scott Brown. Her husband was Robert Venturi. So the same question could also be asked of artists who tackle the built world. How many of them are women? And again, the numbers are small. we're mostly talking about men who deal with that. We've got Gordon Matta Clark and Dan Graham, both of whom are influences on Genzken and friends of hers and who actually figure in the show upstairs. But women who get credit for this are few. Same thing with architecture critics. There are very few women architecture critics who we know. So I thought here to have Genzken, the master artist, whose subject has been architecture, seemed a little apt for me to talk about. And in her work, she's carried on a masterful critique of architecture in post-war Germany in the US. It's as if the two in her vision were twinned, as if she truly sees the vampiric nature of both of them, each sprung from the Bauhaus and the way they're tied together. Empire and vampire, these doubles and ghosts of the other. Also to say Empire Vampire is the name of a piece of hers. It's actually one I'm not talking about, but I'm using the name because just as there's a dialectic implied in it, her work captures the dialectic of modernism. She loves and criticizes it, and throughout her work, she tangles with both sides, and that is also what gives her work power, because there's a beauty in her work when she's examining what she perceives as ugly and a failure, say post-war German architecture, or even what's happened more recently in Berlin. So, now on to Germany. So, where architecture is concerned, Germany has disappointed Isa Genzken, and her take on it can be summed up by this conversation she had with Joseph Beuys, which to me nearly reads as sketch comedy. I can see them as actors in one of her films even. Architecture, Genzken says to Beuys, is a catastrophe in Germany. We've got to change that. Go ahead, Beuys says to Genzken. You can always sign for me. And so for her, German architecture was always dreary and disappointing. And this was a problem to be solved, or at least pointed out in her work. So it's funny. Here I am, the provincial me, that is, coming to Europe from New York, where I live now, to Vienna and talking about architecture. I mean, this is the very city with the most progressive social housing program. And social housing is definitely part of the context of Genzken's work. Her mother still lives in one of the oldest social housing developments on the outskirts of Berlin. And then there's Bonn, the accidental capital, which, Bonn, as a city, strikes me as somewhere between a fable and a joke as well. Bonn was built in this very slapdash way, and then at the moment when the German parliament believes it will be in Bonn forever, the wall comes down, which is the context for her work, like this, which you saw earlier, the pile of rubbish, and also her Bahnhof here, with the two little architectural figures in it, and how poor the buildings were in Germany at that point. And if you look here at her plaster buildings from the early 80s, these kind of lumpy, haphazard forms, they have names like chapel and Bahnhof and house. They also have a grace to them. And each is a type, almost platonic, as if they're generic. But they also suggest the quick, sloppy nature of building after the war, as if everything has been thrown up in an instant and is no more solid than the plaster itself with which she's made these. And then, a couple years later, she starts making these, her concrete forms, with names like Atelier and Passage, Door and TV. They look like maquette and a building fragment, as if what she's showing is the thing itself and rubble, model and ruin. And in them, you can see the ghosts of the wood forms she's used to cast the concrete, almost as if the wood itself is a phantom. And looking at these, I think of Bonn specifically, a capital no one was particularly committed to. It had little planning. You get haphazard buildings like the Langer Eugen, which is out of proportion with everything else, or Günter Benesch's Bundestag, with its raw concrete floors instead of marble. And weeks after it opened, I love this quote, a tour guide reported happily, "Many of our guests say, 'Oh, it's not finished yet,' as if that was a good thing." And this is the entire antithesis of New York City, whose buildings, whose solidity, as Genzken put it, she loved. So Germany has this dreariness, but it's also where modernism was allied with progress, openness, where no spear-like Nazi architecture would ever happen again. Instead, it would be the direct opposite of that. and national identity would be espoused through government buildings that looked about as modest as a bank branch. And this is the country where so much housing was needed, where it was, yes, modern, and the miracle, and suffused with the idea of equality, but it was also dreary and cheap and rational, and there was nothing beautiful about it. And these issues became the subject of her early work. So instead of signing Boy's name, she found a subject, and she also gave it a stark grace that revealed its truth. But she also went to New York City. She went to the Empire State. So she comes here, and she finds a city that seems the direct opposite of her experience in Germany. And she says, "When I first went to New York, I was so fascinated by the architecture and so glad that something like it existed and that I was able to have this visual experience that I thought to myself, this is where I want to live." There was the Empire State Building from the 30s and the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers were extremely modern. So, this is where I want to live. And in New York, there's not much concrete building, but there is the Empire State Building, an elaborate deco skyscraper, and so too, the Chrysler Building. They were both phantoms of the other. They were actually built in competition with each other, competing to be the tallest building in the world at the time. And neither tried to express their function or truth in materials, though they were built at about the same time the Bauhaus was active. So just look at this silly Chrysler Building. It's got gargoyles like a cathedral. Can you see them? So, when the Bauhaus came to America, though, it became like a vampire of its original intentions. Here, it was called the International Style. And in the US, that international style was blood-sucking. It was not about social progress, but money. And here, the idea of a better world was aligned with corporate might. And the international style became that non-style, the look of money and corporate headquarters. And it got a bit closer, too, to buildings like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. That is to say, it got less functional and a little more fancy. So, in her work, when she comes to America, there's this push and pull between social progress and what the city can be, between the weirdness of gargoyles on a skyscraper and the dream of a better world. But she also visits Chicago. And that was one key stop for her in her development. She goes there in the early 90s. And Chicago is kind of the capital city of the Midwest. It's also the birthplace of the skyscraper, and the place where she had her first major American show. And here she moved from concrete to light. So, before I go on, I want to shed some light. And I'm going to show you some windows. These windows without glass, as if you can get a clearer view from them. And this is a slide here from her show at the Renaissance Society that she did in Chicago in 1992. And the show is called Everyone Needs at Least One Window. So Chicago is not just the town where she goes to discover windows. It's where Mies van der Rohe moves after Germany, and where he perfects his idea for walls of glass, for windows as structure and light. And he, too, is one of Genzken's heroes, as you might recall from that early drawing from 1983. So, just for a second, hold on to these windows, because I'm going to take a small historical detour to the Chicago fire and Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Now, this is a scene from just after the Chicago fire. So, Chicago burned down in 1871, and the fire was started by the O'Leary's barn, and their cow gets the blame for kicking over a lantern. Nobody knows if that's true or not. So after that, though, Chicago becomes a modern city. It's built on a grid with buildings of steel, with elevators that were invented there. So when you get the elevator, you can finally get buildings over 7 stories high because you can go up higher. So you get the beginning of the skyscraper. And here, Genzken makes a film called Chicago Drive. And these are 3 stills from it. And the movie celebrates the city's skyscrapers and its architecture, and most of all, the windows in these buildings and how they work to let in light. So she makes the movie, and it's part of her show, Everyone Needs at Least One Window. And that title, about needing a window, is part of what social housing brought. For the first time, people had enough light. In the historic development where her mother lives, like, glass was a key feature. And so people went from living in basically dank ghettos to having light-filled spaces where everyone did need a window. And here in Chicago, something else happens. Mies achieves his dream of glass architecture. Now, this was his idea in the early 1920s. This is a model of his from about 1922 in Germany. And he made the maquette at about the same time Genzken's mother's community was being built on the outskirts of Berlin. And this is where he dreamed up this kind of honeycombed hallucination of a glass tower. So, impossible in 1922, but full of hope. And so remembering this glittering honeycomb of glass for later, because I'm going to come back to it. So Chicago is where the dream of the Bauhaus turns, where you get the walls of glass, but where it becomes corporate might. So here modernism doesn't express government humility or openness. In the US, it's not been tied to building social housing, but to money and manor homes for the wealthy. In the US, modernism is just about class and taste, as if modernism here is only a phantom of the original. And those who got it were the rich, like Edith Farnsworth, whose floating glass house Mies built, or at, say, 860 to 880 Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, which is covered in non-functional I-beams, so it doesn't even express its function, but adornment. And Genzken, she sees both sides. This is the power in her work, which is to love and to critique, to express the dialectic, to see Mies in light of the deco and decorative Empire State Building, and also to see the city, to come to the city where he perfected windows, and she celebrates that in her movie. And there, I have to say, like, I really wanted a still from her movie that I couldn't show you, but I can try and describe it. So there's a scene where there's a window washer at a plaza, kind of like this one here. And he's got a squeegee to clean the windows, and it's on these long, long extensions, because he's trying to reach up really high, and it's really comic because it arches and bows. And he looks like a character in a Chaplin movie. So she captures the absolute ridiculousness, too, in all of this. But in Chicago, this is where Genzken doesn't just find the comedy of a Chaplin movie with the window washer. It's where she starts her windows. These windows. These nearly medieval triptychs, as if the name window itself were Platonic. And the window not even about the glass, but the opening and the light and the possibility. Cast in resin, they glow golden. Or they're her X pieces like this, which, in fact, are taken from the braces on the Hancock Tower. So she points out the beauty of the thing itself and its ornamental quality, and she's asking us to make associations. This is what she's doing by isolating and separating these elements from the whole, just like she did with her concrete maquettes. She lets us see the beauty and the larger truth around it. So she goes back to New York City in the mid-90s. But before that, when she goes there, her aesthetic changes. But before I get to that, I have to move this a little bit. I think that might allow me to read a little more easily. No, it doesn't. Okay, so she goes back to New York in the mid-90s, and at that point, her aesthetic changes. But before I go on to sort of talking about that work, I'm going to talk about myself a little bit. I'm going to get a little personal, and I'm going to talk about getting lost and perhaps found in a city and what that was like for me. And I'm also going to talk about Walter Benjamin, because I love this quote. And he says, or wrote rather, "Not to find one's way in a city may well be uninteresting and banal. It requires ignorance, nothing more. But to lose oneself in a city, as one loses oneself in a forest, that calls for quite a different schooling." And so this moment in the mid-90s, that's also the time I fell in love with buildings. It was a moment for me of clubs and raves and late nights and no mornings. I would skate at 3 a.m. alone along an abandoned Wall Street, and I'd feel free and lost and open. It was just me and the buildings towering above, dark and glittering, lights on like diamonds. I felt a relationship to them, to the glass lobbies and fancy works of art in them, moving through space light as air. The only people I'd see were as invisible as I was, custodians, cleaners, and security guards. But at that moment, in those early hours of the day, that was our town and our time. It belonged to us. And I look at the work she started in that time in the mid-90s in New York, and I feel like she's portraying my city, one where you can get lost, one maybe where she and I passed in the night. Passed, say, the Deutsche Bank building here, which no longer exists. It actually had to come down a few years after 9/11 because it was partly damaged in 9/11. Or also on Wall Street, this building here, which is the Chase Manhattan Plaza Tower, and was the building, built in the 60s, that first brought skyscrapers to Wall Street. And it's now on the Register of Historic Places. So I would be there skating around Wall Street, and the street itself, the road, felt powerful, as if capital coursed through it like an electric current through the ground. And a friend told me this was because Wall Street had been a Lenape, a sacred ground for the Lenape. Now, they were the tribe that actually traded Manhattan for $24 in shell beads. And I have no idea if it was sacred, but Genzken is also in the city at this time in the mid-90s and looking at and loving the buildings and finding a relationship with them. And perhaps the Lenape haunt some of that work too, but I'll get to that in a bit. So, number 11. I love New York, crazy city. So this is the city she sees in the 90s. She's showing us a New York that is skyscrapers and contradictions, trash and beauty. And she starts to show people perhaps how to get lost there, and definitely a city that's different from the standard tourist version. And this is how she describes what she was trying to do. The idea was to make a guidebook for New York, not a normal one, but something for people who wanted to experience New York differently, a lot crazier, more multifaceted and beautiful. And I love that quote. And this is how she does it, is with this book here. And so to do this, her materials begin to change. She needs a different aesthetic. She starts to capture the city and those experiences. They're transcendent, mixed up, none of it isolated or divisible from the other or the context. And in her hands, collage is that way to reach out and pull us into the urban experience. Her work gets more urgent, faster, more real, I'd say. And there, in the mid-90s, she takes snapshots of buildings and collages images and receipts and headlines together to make I Love New York, Crazy City. And I should just tell you that that phrase, I love New York, not the crazy city part, because they would never have said that as an actual tourist brochure. That phrase was coined in the 70s as New York City went bankrupt. And this was a last-ditch effort to save the city, was that phrase. So these books about the city are strung through with her love of it, and that way getting lost reveals something truer and more essential than the facts. And she shows us a city where poetry and possibility exist, but also something messier happens there too. And it's as if to get lost, you need that messiness. And in this too, she uncovers a truth and beauty in the city, and she asks us to reconsider it. Now, Grace Building. I have to say, I love those two words together. I mean, it sounds like, what are we doing? Are we building grace? Is it a building? Now, it in fact is the name of a building, one on 42nd Street, opposite Bryant Park. And it's a building Genzken and I have both noticed. And this is a slide I took of it about a month ago, a picture I took of it. And I was seduced by this building in my early 20s. I remember walking along 42nd Street, going inside to hear Derrida talk at CUNY, which is the City University of New York. Now, I don't remember the Derrida talk at all, other than the fact of it happening. But I do remember the curves of this building and being just swept up by that curve and Gordon Bunshaft's white travertine rising overhead, and the way, as I walked in, my heart lurched. Now, Genzken also photographed the Grace Building, and you can see it. I'm going to just mark it here, right there, back. So Genzken also photographed the Grace Building, and it's here in her series, New York, New York. And in these photos, she captures the truth of the buildings, She doesn't create an exact image of them, not one where you can necessarily name or identify the building necessarily, but one where you get the experience of it. And she captures the curve too. And this is the city she celebrates, a little hallucinatory and often weird, where things have ghosts and twins. And the Grace Building itself has a twin, a kind of dark version, the Solo Building, which is all black glass like a dark phantom on 57th Street. Now, I want you to think, as I move on, of that black glass with this quote on the screen. And I want you to think of buildings and what the city might be possible to do. So this quote, what? You have no colored glass, no pink, no red, no blue, no magic panes, no panes of paradise? Scoundrel, what do you mean by going into poor neighborhoods without a single glass to make life beautiful? So, this is a quote from Baudelaire from his Bad Glazier, and she chose this essay, in fact, to accompany her Phaidon monograph. And in this little story, the narrator plays a practical joke on the glazier, and the joke is pretty cruel. The glass ends up broken. There's a accident involving 6 flights of stairs. Anyway, but this rebuke comes before the joke, and the glazier walks all the way up the 6 flights of stairs to the narrator's flat. And there's this amazing line about glass and color and the need for beauty. And that quote may well sum up her take on cities. So here we have 2 twinned projects through which I want you to remember that quote. And the first is Fuck the Bauhaus. And the second one, which I'm going to show you in a second, is New Buildings for Berlin. But first, we're going to stay with Fuck the Bauhaus. So think of that quote and the ideal of beauty and adornment. And Fuck the Bauhaus was made for New York, a city where even Mies van der Rohe brings decoration to buildings. And here, with her models, she underlines what the city is, constructing buildings from pizza boxes and playbills, plastic and bold orange construction fencing, like a pillbox hat, and also oysters, as if she's connecting the city back to its Lenape roots too, oysters being native to New York Harbor and dying out. And the city sold off for shell beads, often made of oyster shells. And it's as if she can see here what it becomes later. So Fuck the Bauhaus also makes me think of Mies Seagram's building, where decoration is the expression of a truth that isn't so true. It's made to look good, but the I-beams on its exterior have nothing to do with function versus the barren functionalism in Germany. So here, I see the oysters, and I actually think of those I-beams stuck on the Seagram's building. Only she celebrates a New York City that's weirder and crazier and more ideal, and it has hula dancers on the floor. So, now, onto New Buildings for Berlin. So, Berlin is the exact opposite of New York City, in a sense. And when I'm talking about Berlin, I'm talking about Berlin in the 2000s, after the wall's down, when it's being rebuilt. And there's this quote, which I love and am terrified by. A city is destroyed even as it's created. And it's by a Japanese architect, Arata Isozaki, who was in on rebuilding Berlin. And in Berlin, he made this. And he also made this for Disney World, both of which I think are stunningly ugly and the same building. So, think of that Glazier quote. Think of the colored glass and Potsdamer Platz, place of Wim Wenders, Der Himmel über Berlin. Sorry, because my pronunciations are bad. And think, too, of rabbits running through a no man's land. And now think of her New Buildings for Berlin. Yes. And these are the twin, the vampire to fuck the Bauhaus. And the site itself in Berlin, Potsdamer Platz, which she was thinking of with this series, is not bold colors. It is not better. It does not have the lessons of Bonn or social housing. This is not the idea of improving lives, or even any sort of beauty. Instead, what you get in Berlin is money. So we go from German architects making a modest capital to Germany's first corporate architecture and all the lost opportunities and starchitecture of Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano and Isozaki with his ugly building and his dark quote, which seems pretty vampiric too to me. And her version is haunted by Mies. Remember that honeycomb tower I showed you, the model? So here you can see it in the hints, like hinted at in his hallucinatory vision and what she actually does. So next though, another architect who is in on Berlin, Philip Johnson. Yes. Now Philip Johnson was in on rebuilding Berlin, and he also built a not particularly attractive building there. But he built this one he's clutching here, and it's a model of one that's in New York City, and it's called the AT&T building. But at the time that Berlin was happening, Genzken sort of starts to think about what this building might be, and she sort of comically reimagines it. So before I go on, I should explain who Philip Johnson is. Because more than any single person, he was responsible for the Bauhaus's coming to the US. He was MoMA's first architecture curator, and he worked with Mies on the Seagram's building, kind of greasing the wheels to make sure it happened. And he championed the international style in the US. In fact, he called it that. He came up with the name. And he himself moved with styles from the time, starting with his own Bauhaus-ish glass house and modernism, and moving to postmodernism here with his AT&T building. And here is Genzken's image of it that she shot in her New York series in the late 90s. And she thought the building pretty ridiculous and reimagined it funnier and truer with her Deutsche Bank proposal. But his building, I mean, it is really deeply silly. But I kind of appreciate it. Like, I have a very American love of this building. And it was built as the headquarters for AT&T, which was the US telephone giant. And AT&T had at one point been Ma Bell, which was one of our few government-owned monopolies. And so not long after they were deregulated, they got this headquarters with that overgrown lintel. Now that lintel actually suggests a Chesterfield, which is a kind of classic colonial era chest of drawers. So here, the building actually becomes redolent of kind of Americana and history. But in her hands, it's an alien. Like, it looks like a little alien there. And also a radio. And it also connects to an even older series of works of hers made in concrete, her world receivers. Radios here with antenna stuck into the concrete. Okay, so now we are on to thought 16 of my 18 thoughts. We are on to her social facades. So, to me, buildings are social. They're the fabric of our world. Society is tied up in them. But I am also the woman who can fall in love with the curve on a building, like the Grace Building, not to mention the name of the building. So for me, buildings are often full of memories and associations. And I think that's the case for Genzken too. This idea that architecture can contain our experiences. And I think that's also part of what she does with the AT&T building, is that she sees something truer in the buildings than just the architecture. And as she's looking at social facades, she actually has a series called Social Facades, which are these here. And she collages them together, and they're a little similar to the MLR paintings, the more light research paintings I showed you earlier. But those were really careful, really controlled as she looked at the sort of surfaces and the facades of buildings. And here, the materials are layered together and kind of collaged with a looseness. And this use of materials has them kind of reach out to us because they're reflective and shiny and mylar. And to me, they suggest nightclubs and skating around the World Trade Center late at night at 3 in the morning by myself. But she also makes even more social facades. And these are her columns. And these are often named for friends and people she respects. And here they're grouped together. Now, throughout my talk, I've been using a lot of quotes. And many of the quotes I've been using are from interviews she did with Wolfgang Tillmans in 2003 and 2005. Now, Genzken doesn't do many interviews, and hers with him are particularly great because of their friendship. So, friendships are quite big for her. And in these, we have Kai, and we have Isa, and we have Dan, and we have Andy, and we have Wolfgang. So, this is another social facade of sorts. And this is the collaboration she and Tillmans did in 2001 with his photography and her installation, Science Fiction. And you are lucky because you will be able to see this upstairs. So her mirrored towers can seem like the reflection of Dan Graham's, who was another friend and one of the named columns earlier. And it can seem as if she's maybe addressing minimalism here, but instead, her work isn't so removed or so distant as minimalism. It's social space. And it's not just the social space shared with her friend. And if you look at this image here, you can imagine the party, the BPMs, the shudder of bass, and this, the day afterwards, reflected. And so here, she harkens back to the disco, back to minimalism, as if to show where those hi-fi stereo towers should be. Remember those ads I showed you from 1979? And she returns to architecture again. So in all this, you get the negative hallucination, the familiar reconfigured, a greater truth, something I, might have slid past on the street. She uses materials that connects our world to us, like the hi-fi towers. So remember how she said when I started that she wanted her work to reach out to us? It is, and it does, no question about it. So when she uses the construction fencing here, it's both what it is, fencing, and something else, a hat. So it's connected to its original use and transformed. So we get to see these materials through the ghost of its original purpose and remade. And in her hands, our world is both, as she asks us to associate and to connect. Now, that netting is about to reappear in the German pavilion for the Venice Biennale. But first, this is another quote with Nikolaus Schaffhausen. And she says, "Everything about the building annoyed me. Everything. I'm very much against the building." And so she was talking specifically about the pavilion. But look at this. She hates the building, and look at what she does with it. God, isn't this beautiful? I mean, I just shudder when I see this. I mean, it's so triumphant and simple. It's the exterior, just clothed, veiled in the construction netting and her Della Robbia reliefs, but it's utterly new and transformed. Only the project is bigger than any mere architectural intervention or commentary on the building. I mean, just take the installation's very name, which is oil. So it takes on the ties that bind us together, resources and politics, America and imperialism. And this is a larger thread also through her work. And I could have focused on it in my talk instead of architecture, because it's a theme that she's been developing since 2001, since 9/11. And it's where she's been moving, so away a bit from the built world to the larger ties that hold the world together. But, and as she sort of explores these things, it's still like she manages to find the beauty and the ugliness, the critique and the celebration in it. So, thought number 18, which is my last thought. Disco, soon, New York, for the Empire City. Now, like me, who would skate around the city at 4 a.m. on Wall Street, where clubs were important and the city is a social sphere, that is the key to this last project I'm going to talk about tonight. And that's the ethos that comes through with her project for the World Trade Center. Now, after 9/11, I'm sure you guys all saw photos of the city. It was transformed. Things were taped up, photos, candles, makeshift memorials. Images were stuck through fencing and onto walls. And it was like her materials and the city collided, as if grief and Genzken were tied together. And think of her new buildings for Berlin and that city's lost opportunity. So here, in her Ground Zero proposal, it's like she's speaking to Libeskind himself, who created the master plan for the former World Trade Center site. And she has here a parking garage, a church, a light, a disco, a memorial. And her answer addresses the city and the social sphere and what architecture is supposed to do. It's also a love letter to New York, to that place she first visited at 21 and where she wanted to move, where she saw the essential joy and freedom and weirdness and possibility of getting lost in a city. And she is not going to let this moment go without addressing it. Now, in an interview she did with Kasper Koenig, she says, "The designs are only a slight change in what was once there, that is, the Twin Towers. Now they have designed other towers, business towers, always just business towers. They are supposed to be taller than any others in the world, so more or less inhuman things. I just thought somebody should do something for this space that is very social. Yes, always just business towers. Never anything social, never anything for people. So there's this need to be human, to be humane. And instead, she proposes these. We get a chapel, and then there's her hospital. And who wouldn't want to stay here with the shot glasses at the bottom and the vase on the top? And I have to say, looking at this, I do actually think of the AT&T building with its lintel. I have to say. And we get her memorial. And here we have an installation shot at MoMA of most of the buildings together. And in these, the names are pretty much generic and unspecific. Like, think of those original plaster works I showed you from the early, mid-'80s. And so here, though, they're like built from casters and plywood and found materials. Or, like this one here, from high-end pieces from Cartel by, I think, the Burlek brothers. I could be wrong. You could tell me, am I wrong? Okay. So this is a vision of the city where she shows what it can be, what New York is, or what it was. And this is the place that's actually nearly lost today. So here's the disco again. I love this disco. So she'd been talking about building a 24-hour disco in Central Park. Like, she'd had this idea. And instead, she cites it here, and it's her Disco Soon New York, and it's named for the club flyer on the outside. And clubs are obviously social and freeing and transcendent. They're a bit like a church where you could escape yourself. And New York can certainly use a release. In the years after 2001, it's changed. It's more like zone shopping districts. It's more normal. It's less weird. It's a place of wealth. It's not a city for art or ideas anymore, and there are far fewer clubs. So this is a picture I took on the street in April. Now, it's just some weird concrete cylinder at the base of a streetlight. And above it, on the metal pole, is taped some flyer with a model on it. Now, this photo I took just off the Bowery by 5th or 6th Street. But it's across from what used to be, what was, for 155 years, a free art and architecture school, Cooper Union. It was the only free university in the United States. And now, in what might be a fable of New York, it's charging money. It's done real estate deals, and it even owns the land under the Chrysler Building, that vampire building, the ghost of the Empire State Building. Now this, here, would be the negative hallucination. This would be something I'd have easily ignored were it not for Isa Genzken. But she showed me a city and how to see it, how not to walk past it, how to observe. And without her take on New York, I probably wouldn't have noticed this. I certainly wouldn't have taken the picture. But her gift to me has been a guidebook to the city that is crazier and more beautiful. And that way, she connects her work physically to our world, allows you and me to walk past Cooper Union on a warm Friday this past spring after having a drink in an outdoor cafe and see this and see the city anew. She changed the city for me, and in her hands, it's transgressive and transcendent. Thank you.